Story 1. I grew up in a quiet little suburb just outside a small town where everyone knew each other, or at least pretended to. Nothing big ever happened there. No wild parties, no unsolved mysteries, just the steady rhythm of small-town life. My dad was my hero growing up, always fixing stuff around the house, teaching me how to change tires and drive a nail straight. When he passed away, it hit hard. You never really expect the people who keep your world steady to just be gone. It was about 6 months after he died when this thing happened. I just turned 20 and was living at home with my mom. She was having a rough time without dad. Nights were hard for her, so she'd often fall asleep on the sofa with the TV on, like the background noise could fill the empty spaces in the house. That night started out normal enough. I went to bed around midnight after scrolling through my phone for way too long. I remember feeling uneasy, but I chalked it up to the usual stress and went to sleep. At least I think I did. The next thing I knew, I was dreaming, or at least I thought I was dreaming. I woke up in my bed, heart racing, because I swear I heard my dad's voice downstairs, clear as day, calling my name the way he used to when I was a kid and stayed up too late. "Come down here, buddy." My first thought was that I was losing it. I rubbed my face and tried to shake it off. But curiosity, or something deeper, got the better of me. So I got out of bed and went to my window, which overlooked the back garden. That's when I saw it. There was someone, or something, standing just beyond the hedges at the edge of the yard. A dark figure, completely still. No face, no features, just this looming black outline against the faint glow of the streetlights. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. And then I heard it again, my dad's voice. "Come down here, buddy." Only this time, it wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from the garden, right where that figure was standing. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My chest tightened, and I couldn't move for what felt like forever. My dad's voice, but it was wrong somehow. Too hollow, too stretched, like someone mimicking him, but not getting it quite right. The sheer wrongness of it snapped me out of my frozen state, and I stumbled back from the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it'd burst. That's when I woke up for real, or at least I thought I did. I was sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my hands shaking. I could still hear echoes of that twisted voice in my head, but the house was silent, too silent. No mum snoring softly downstairs, no TV hum. Just this thick, unsettling quiet. I tried to brush it off as a nightmare, but something gnawed at me. My skin prickled with a feeling I couldn't shake, like I wasn't alone. I threw on a hoodie and bolted down the stairs. The moment my feet hit the living room floor, I saw it. The back door was wide open, not just unlocked but fully ajar, the sheer curtain fluttering in the cold night air. My stomach dropped. Mum was still asleep on the sofa, oblivious. I crept over, my pulse thudding in my ears, and nudged her awake. "Mum," I whispered harshly, "why's the door open?" She blinked groggily, rubbing her eyes. "What?" "The back door," I said louder this time. "It's wide open." She sat up, confusion etched across her face. "I must have forgotten to lock it," she mumbled. "I don't remember opening it, though." I didn't say anything. I just walked over and shut it, locking both the knob and the deadbolt for good measure. The garden was empty now, just shadows dancing in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been there, watching. I double-checked the locks before heading back upstairs, my mind racing. Had it all been a dream? The voice, the figure, the open door, none of it made sense, but it felt real, too real. The next morning, everything was back to normal, or so I thought. Mum was making coffee when she mentioned it casually over breakfast. "Did you hear about the break-ins last night?" I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. "What break-ins?" "3 houses on our street," she said. "Middle of the night. They think the burglars came in through unlocked back doors. Scary, isn't it?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yeah," I managed to say. "Scary." I didn't tell her about the dream, or the figure in the garden, or the voice that sounded like Dad but wasn't. Nobody would have believed me anyway. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But here's the thing, I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. It wasn't my dad. Story 2. I lived in a small, creaky old house just outside Pikeville, Kentucky. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, narrow hallways, and hardwood floors that complained under your feet, even if you tiptoed. The nights out there were pitch black. No streetlights, just the occasional flicker of deer passing by the window if the moon was bright enough. I always slept with the door cracked open, not because I was scared, but because it made it easier to hear if something was moving outside the house. That night, I remember lying in bed, dead tired from a long shift at work. It was winter, and the cold had seeped into the walls. I had this old heater by the bed that hummed softly, just enough white noise to drown out the usual creaks of the house settling. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up, or at least I thought I did. The kind of jarring wake-up where you aren't sure if you'd been dreaming or not. But then it happened. I rolled over too fast, lost my balance, and fell straight out of bed. My knees hit the floor hard, and for a second, I just stayed there, dazed, trying to gather myself. That's when I noticed something strange. The floor beneath me wasn't the familiar hardwood of my bedroom. It was linoleum, cold, slick under my palms. I stood up, and everything inside me just froze. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was standing in the kitchen of the house we'd lived in a year before. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It had to be a dream, right? But everything felt too real. The chill of the air, the smell of coffee that clung faintly to the countertops, the soft hum of the fridge, things you don't notice in dreams but that ground you firmly in reality. The layout was identical to how it had been when we lived there, but the details were all wrong. The cabinets were a different color, pale green instead of white. The table was round and wooden, nothing like the cheap metal one we'd left behind. And there were photos on the walls of people I didn't recognize. A smiling family, a man, a woman, 2 kids. They weren't us. I tried to tell myself I was sleepwalking or hallucinating. Maybe I'd hit my head harder than I thought when I fell. I needed to get a grip, find my way back to my room. The window by the sink was always my landmark in that kitchen. I'd spent countless mornings staring out of it, watching the fog roll over the fields. I moved toward it, slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I looked out, the view confirmed what I already knew deep down. I wasn't in my current house. I was back on the old property, the one we'd left after too many strange things started happening. But even that was wrong. The yard was overgrown, tangled with weeds. A rusted swing set stood half buried in the brush, something that had never been there when we lived there. The sky was heavy and dark, not with clouds, but with something else. Something that pressed down on the earth like a suffocating weight. I backed away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I needed to get out of that room, back to my bed, back to my life. I turned and saw the hallway leading toward the bedrooms. It was dark, just like I remembered it, narrow and lined with faded wallpaper that had peeled in places. My feet carried me forward without thinking, the house dead silent except for the sound of my breathing. When I reached the door that should have been my old bedroom, I hesitated. The doorknob was cold under my hand, and I had this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't open it. But I did anyway. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a familiar sight that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't the room from the old house. It was my current room. Same bed, same cluttered nightstand, same heater humming softly in the corner. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and shut the door behind me. The moment the latch clicked, a heavy silence settled over everything. For a long minute, I just stood there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was impossible. None of it made sense. Desperate for some kind of confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, I turned around and opened the door again, half expecting to see that strange house on the other side. But it was just my hallway. Everything was normal again. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to piece together what I just experienced. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Had I slipped into some kind of parallel version of my own life? Just for a few minutes? I'll never know. Story 3. Growing up on the Caribbean coast of Central America, I spent most of my childhood outdoors. It was the kind of place where the thick scent of salt and damp earth always lingered in the air, and you could hear the rustle of palm trees even when the breeze was faint. Back then, My cousins, brother, and I filled our afternoons with games that usually ended with dirty clothes and bruised knees. That particular day, though, something happened that I've never been able to shake off. It was around 5 p.m., the time when the sky starts shifting from bright blue to a dim gray, signaling that night was creeping in. We were out in the backyard of my grandmother's old wooden house, competing to see who could dig the deepest hole. The ground was dry but loose enough for our little hands to scoop out clumps of dirt. We weren't thinking about snakes or bugs, just who would claim the title of champion digger. I wandered off a bit to the left, away from the rest of them. I liked having my own space to dig without anyone crowding me. My brother was busy teasing one of our cousins, who kept swatting at him with a muddy hand. I didn't care. I was focused on winning. By then, I had managed to dig a hole deep enough that I could fit my whole arm into it, almost up to my elbow. I was proud of myself, feeling like I might actually beat everyone this time. I reached down, fingers scrabbling for more dirt, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, but as I pulled my arm out of the hole, I froze. There was something white and smoky following my hand. Not just floating aimlessly like mist, but moving deliberately as if it was trying to grab me. It wasn't a solid hand, but it wasn't entirely formless either. It had the vague shape of fingers and a palm, though it flickered like smoke caught in the wind. I couldn't see bones or skin, just this shifting, translucent whiteness trailing my arm. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, my arm still halfway out of the hole, watching as this thing hovered inches away from me. For a split second, I thought it would grab me, pull me back down into the dirt. My mind raced with wild thoughts. Stories I'd heard from old folks about spirits that lurk near the ground, waiting for foolish children to wander too far alone. Then as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I yanked my arm the rest of the way out and stumbled backward, kicking up dirt as I scrambled to my feet. My heart was racing so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Did you see that?" My cousins and brother stopped what they were doing and stared at me confused. "See what?" my brother asked, brushing dirt off his hands. I struggled to find the words. Something was in the hole, like a hand. But it wasn't a hand. They laughed, thinking I was messing with them. "Maybe you found a ghost," one of my cousins teased, making spooky noises and waving his hands around dramatically. I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't joking, but the words got stuck in my throat. How could I explain what I had seen when I didn't even understand it myself? Instead, I just stood there trembling, while they went back to their game as if nothing had happened. I never told anyone else about it. Not my parents, not my grandmother. It felt too strange, too unreal. But I know what I saw. It wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't a trick of the light. Story 4. When I was about 8 years old, we lived in this quiet little neighborhood just outside of Pikeville, Kentucky. The kind of place where the only sounds at night were crickets and the occasional dog barking in the distance. Nothing fancy about our house. 3 bedrooms, a big front porch, and a patchy backyard where my dad kept promising to plant grass but never did. My room was down the hall from my parents', painted this awful pale blue my mom thought was calming. There wasn't much in it besides my twin bed, a dresser, and this old wicker basket I kept in the corner for dirty clothes. It was one of those with a rounded lid attached by flimsy little hinges. My mom had found it at a yard sale and brought it home like it was some treasure. I never cared much for it, though. It always creaked when you opened or closed it, like it was groaning under its own weight. I remember the night it happened like it was yesterday. It was late, probably close to midnight. I know because I'd been trying to fall asleep for what felt like hours, just staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to my ceiling. My parents had already gone to bed, and the house was completely still. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen and the old pipes creaking now and then. That's when I noticed it, the feeling. You ever get that weird sensation like someone's standing behind you, even when you know nobody's there? That's what hit me, this creeping, crawling unease that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I pulled my blanket up to my chin and tried to shake it off, Told myself I was being dumb, that it was just my imagination. But it didn't go away. Then I heard the creak. At first, I thought it was the floorboards settling. Old houses make noises, right? But this wasn't random. It was deliberate, slow, like someone was carefully shifting their weight, trying not to be heard. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, to that stupid wicker basket. The lid was moving. I swear to God it was rising. Just a couple of inches, but enough for me to see it clear as day. I froze, my heart thudding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it didn't stop. The lid hovered there, suspended in midair like someone was holding it up from the inside. But there was no one there. It wasn't just tilting on its hinges either. It was floating. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My whole body felt paralyzed, like I was glued to the bed. All I could do was stare, my eyes locked on that impossible sight. The lid stayed up for what felt like forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then, just as slowly as it had lifted, it lowered back down with a soft creak. Silence. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. I kept waiting for something else to happen, for the lid to fly open, for something to crawl out of that basket, but nothing did. Finally, I found my voice, though it came out as more of a strangled whimper than a scream. "Mom!" I bolted out of bed, my feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. "Mom! Dad!" Their door flew open, and my dad came stumbling out, half asleep and blinking against the hallway light. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "The basket," I gasped, pointing back toward my room. "The lid. It moved. It floated." My mom appeared behind him, wrapping her robe tight around herself. "Honey, calm down. You probably just had a bad dream." "It wasn't a dream," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. "I saw it. I swear." My dad sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, let's take a look." I didn't want to go back in there, but I followed close behind, clinging to my mom's arm. The room looked exactly the same as I'd left it, except for that basket. It just sat there in the corner, innocent as ever. My dad walked over and gave the lid a few experimental lifts, making it creak like it always did. "See? Nothing wrong with it." "But it floated," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I saw it float." He knelt down beside me, his expression softening. "Your imagination's just playing tricks on you, buddy. Happens to everyone sometimes." I wanted to argue to make them believe me, but I knew it was pointless. They wouldn't understand. How could they? After they tucked me back into bed and turned off the light, I lay there wide awake, my eyes fixed on that basket. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. Story 5. It was late, maybe just past midnight, and I was driving back home from my shift at the psychiatric facility. The air was heavy with winter dampness, thick and quiet. You know that kind of silence when the cold wraps itself around everything and muffles the world? Yeah, it was like that. The usual drive was about 30 minutes through some back roads and a brief stretch of unplanted farmland, a shortcut most folks in my area take to shave off time. I had my high beams on since there wasn't a single car in sight, just dark, open land on both sides and the cracked asphalt ahead. It was the kind of lonely road where your own engine noise starts to sound unnatural after a while. I was zoning out, thinking about grabbing a quick bite at home before crashing, when I spotted something up ahead. At first, it didn't register as anything weird, just a stick or branch hanging about 15 feet off the ground, maybe 3 or 4 feet long. I figured some farmer's kid had managed to launch it into a power line or some invisible wire strung across the field. I didn't think much of it and kept driving. But as I got closer, something about it started gnawing at me. You ever have that moment where your brain tries to fit what you're seeing into something familiar, but keeps failing? That was me. The stick wasn't just hanging there, it was spinning. Fast. Like crazy fast. I slowed down without even realizing it, my foot easing off the gas as I stared at this thing. The weird part? There were no wires, no poles, nothing for it to be attached to. Just this branch twisting in the air like it was caught in some invisible tornado. But the air was dead still, no wind, not even a breeze. My heart started pounding harder than it should have been, for something as simple as a stick. I rolled down my window a crack, half expecting to hear something, maybe the whir of machinery or a strange hum. But there was nothing, just that eerie winter silence pressing in on me, and that stick spinning like it was glitching out of reality. By now, I'd come to a complete stop in the middle of the road, my headlights casting long beams across the empty fields. The thing didn't waver, didn't drift, just kept spinning faster and faster, like it was defying every rule of physics I'd ever known. I leaned forward over the wheel, squinting, trying to make sense of it. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. "What the hell is that?" I flicked on my hazard lights and put the car in park. Against every ounce of common sense, I opened the door and stepped out. My breath fogged up in front of me as I stood there, eyes locked on that impossible sight. The air smelled sharp and metallic, almost like the tang of blood. There was this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be there, like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. But I couldn't look away. My brain was screaming for an explanation. Drones, wires, maybe some experimental farm tech I didn't know about. But none of it made sense. And then it stopped. Just like that, the branch froze mid-spin, dead still in the air. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might throw up. Every hair on my body stood on end. It hung there for a second, completely motionless, like time itself had skipped a beat. Then it dropped. No slow descent, no wobble, just a sudden, violent plummet straight to the ground. It hit with a sound that was way too loud for a simple branch, like a bone snapping in half. I flinched, my breath hitching in my throat. For a moment, everything went completely still again. I stood there, heart thudding painfully in my chest, waiting for, I don't even know what. Something, anything. But there was nothing, just the branch lying there on the frozen dirt like it had never done anything strange in its life. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled back to the car, slamming the door shut and locking it out of pure instinct. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the car back into gear. I didn't care about hazards or rules of the road. I just floored it, tires skidding on the cold asphalt as I sped away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing floating after me or spinning in the distance. But there was nothing. Just darkness swallowing up the road behind me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my skin was clammy with sweat despite the freezing temperature. I sat there in the car for a long minute, engine idling, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen something impossible. I never took that shortcut again. Story 6, I live in a pretty normal 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's home. My wife and I have a daughter who's about 6, and most of our evenings are just the usual routine. Dinner, laundry, bedtime chaos. You know the drill. It was one of those completely uneventful nights when the weirdest, most terrifying thing I've ever experienced happened. We had just finished folding some clothes and my wife was in our daughter's room trying to settle her down for bed. I was halfway up the stairs carrying a laundry basket and thinking about how I'd probably crash on the couch once the kid was finally asleep. That's when I saw it. Our master bedroom is right at the top of the stairs, with these wooden French doors that always stay propped open. One side is fixed in place, the other swings. As I reached the top step and glanced into the room, something moved. It peeked out from behind the stationary side of the door. Just for a split second, I froze mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a shadow from the hallway lamp. But then my brain caught up with what my eyes had actually seen. It wasn't a shadow. This thing was about 3 feet tall, covered in brown and white fur, with these pointed ears that reminded me of a dog or maybe a cat. But it sure as hell wasn't either of those. Its fur looked matted, like it had been living in some damp, dirty place. And its eyes, God, those eyes were too big for its face, round and black like polished stones, glinting under the dim hallway light. We locked eyes for what couldn't have been more than a second, but that second stretched long enough for every hair on my body to stand straight up. Then it ducked back behind the door. I swear to you, my legs moved before I even told them to. I bolted up the remaining steps, taking them 3 at a time, my pulse hammering in my ears. The laundry basket bounced off my hip and tumbled back down the stairs, but I didn't care. All I could think was, what the hell was that? I hit the doorway hard, practically throwing myself into the master bedroom. Nothing. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made just like we left it. The dresser stood untouched, the curtains drawn halfway across the windows. I stood there panting, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. I checked behind the door first because that's where it had disappeared to. Nothing. Just smooth wooden panels and a faint scuff mark where the doorstop rubbed against the floor. I even dropped to my knees to look under the bed, feeling like an absolute idiot but too shaken to care. Still nothing. The closet? Empty, except for my wife's neatly hung dresses and my wrinkled shirts. I straightened up slowly, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been a weird shadow after all, or my brain playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I saw. "Everything okay?" my wife called from down the hall. I jumped, my nerves still frayed. "Yeah," I managed, my voice cracking. "Just drop the laundry." She laughed softly. "Classic you." I forced a chuckle, hoping it sounded normal. But inside, I was still reeling. I didn't want to freak her out, so I kept my mouth shut. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching from just out of sight. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I checked on our daughter twice just to make sure she was safe. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glinting black eyes staring back at me, the pointed ears twitching as it ducked out of sight. I never told my wife about it. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, honey, I think I saw some kind of furry nightmare creature hanging out in our bedroom." "Yeah, no thanks. But I'll tell you this. I still think about it. And the scariest part, I never saw it again." Story 7. I grew up outside the city, where houses were far apart, and you had to rely on buses to get anywhere. My family's place was tucked off a narrow gravel road, about a 10-minute walk from the nearest bus stop. The stop itself was nothing special, just a faded bench under a rusting streetlight that flickered when the wind blew too hard. I was the only person who ever waited there. No neighbors, no other kids from school. Just me. Most mornings were uneventful. I'd get there just before dawn, the cold biting through my jacket as I stared at my breath, fogging up in front of me. The light above the stop cast this pale, weak glow over the road and the patch of cracked concrete where the bus pulled up. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make you feel like you weren't completely swallowed by the dark. Except for that one morning. It was colder than usual, and the fog hung thick in the air. I remember stuffing my hands deeper into my pockets, wishing I'd worn gloves. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way up the hill toward the stop. That was when I saw him, or it, I guess. A figure was pacing back and forth near the bench, just under the flickering light. It was weird because, like I said, nobody else ever waited there. My first thought was that maybe someone's car had broken down, or it was some random guy looking for directions. But the closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. He didn't look like he belonged there. He moved in this jerky, restless way, like he was agitated or impatient. His head kept twitching to the side, like he was checking for something behind him. I slowed my steps, my breath catching in my throat. There was no sound, no gravel crunching, no wind, nothing. Just that guy pacing back and forth. I don't know what made me so nervous, but my body was on high alert, every hair standing on end. I thought about turning around, maybe going back home and telling my parents I missed the bus, but I didn't. I kept walking, each step slower than the last. The figure didn't notice me, or at least he didn't react. Then something strange happened. The closer I got, the harder it was to see him. It didn't make sense. He was right there under the light, but his edges started blurring, like smoke dissolving into the air. I stopped dead in my tracks, blinking hard. I thought maybe it was just the fog messing with my eyes, but no. He was fading. Piece by piece, he just disappeared. First his legs went, melting into the shadows, then his torso, until there was nothing left but the faint outline of his head, twitching unnaturally like before. And then that was gone too. I stood there, heart racing, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. There was nothing there anymore. just the empty bench and that flickering streetlight swaying gently in the breeze. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and bolt back home. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, rooted to the spot like they didn't belong to me anymore. I kept staring at the spot where he'd been, half expecting him to reappear. But all I saw was the faint shimmer of fog under the streetlight. And then there was a sound, a whisper, low and breathy, like someone exhaling right next to my ear. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing, but I swear to God I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt it. Something heavy pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The bus's headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the fog like a blade. The sound of the engine snapped me out of whatever trance I was in. I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward the stop as the bus pulled up with a screech of brakes. The driver, an older guy with a gruff voice, gave me a weird look as I climbed on. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was dry and my hands were shaking. I found a seat near the back, slumping down and pressing my forehead against the cold window. As the bus pulled away, I glanced back at the stop. It was empty. Story 8. It was just after 2 a.m., on one of those muggy, heavy summer nights when even the air feels like it's pressing down on you. I live in a quiet little town. Nothing remarkable, just rows of old houses that creak too much when the wind shifts. My room was sweltering, and I couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd head downstairs for a late-night snack. Maybe grab some leftovers, something cold to beat the heat. The wooden stairs groaned under my bare feet as I made my way down in the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen. Everything was still. Too still, actually. The kind of silence where you start hearing things that aren't there, like phantom whispers in your own ears. I shook it off, blaming it on lack of sleep. I'd always had an overactive imagination anyway. As I reached the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, right in front of me, were what I can only describe as pillars, tall, shifting columns of air. They shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt in the middle of a scorching day, but there was a strange whiteness to them, almost like condensation hanging in the air. They weren't solid, but they moved, twisting slightly as though they were alive. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I even rubbed them like some cartoon character, expecting everything to snap back to normal when I opened them again. But the pillars were still there, pulsing faintly in the dim light. "What the hell?" I whispered under my breath. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and go back upstairs, but stubborn curiosity won out. I took a slow, careful step forward, my breath catching in my throat. The pillars didn't move toward me, but they didn't back off either. They just existed, humming faintly in the space between the living room and the kitchen. I kept walking, heart pounding, trying to plot a clear path through them without touching one. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, maybe heat stroke or dehydration or something. But when I passed through one by accident, every hair on my body stood on end. It was like stepping into ice water, except the cold shot straight up my spine and wrapped itself around my brain. My skin prickled and a violent shudder ran through me before I stumbled out the other side, gasping for breath. I stood there for a second, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The pillars continued to shift and pulse behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I just needed to get to the kitchen, grab my food, and get the hell out of there. The fridge loomed ahead like a safe haven, and I practically lunged for the handle. The cool air washed over my face as I yanked the door open, and for a moment, I felt a small shred of relief. I reached for a leftover sandwich on the shelf, my fingers trembling slightly. That's when I felt it, a presence, heavy, oppressive, and filled with rage. It pressed against my back like a physical weight, and I swear to God, I could feel eyes boring into the back of my skull. Not just any eyes either, it was a woman. I knew it was a woman without needing to turn around. Her anger was palpable, thick as smoke in the air, radiating waves of hostility that made it hard to breathe. My chest tightened, and my stomach turned to ice. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I stood there frozen, with my hand still clutching the sandwich like it was some kind of pathetic shield. The sense of her presence grew sharper, hotter, like she was moving closer, leaning in just inches away from me. My mind raced, logic scrambling to explain it away. Maybe it was just paranoia, a leftover panic from those weird pillars in the living room. Maybe I was just tired, but deep down, I knew better. I could hear her breathing, slow, deliberate, and filled with hate. The realization hit me like a freight train. I was not alone in that kitchen, and whatever was with me wasn't human. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't face whatever it was, not after feeling that raw, seething anger. My only thought was to get back upstairs, shut the door, and pretend none of this ever happened. So I did the only thing I could. I forced my legs to move, yanked the fridge door shut, and bolted for the stairs like my life depended on it. The floorboards creaked loudly beneath my feet as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to know what shape that anger had taken. The moment I crossed the threshold of my room, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my ribcage. I stood there, pressed against the door, listening for any sign that she had followed me. Nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep properly for weeks. I kept trying to tell myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the heat and my overtired brain. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I saw, whatever I felt, was real. And even though it never happened again, I'll never forget the feeling of that hateful, burning gaze drilling into the back of my head. Story 9. I was in 7th grade, home alone on a Tuesday afternoon, waiting for microwave popcorn to finish. My dad had passed away a couple of years earlier, and Mom wasn't the stay-at-home, cookie-baking type. She'd disappear for hours, leaving me to figure out my own meals and entertainment. That afternoon, the usual post-school cartoons were on. Rescue Rangers or DuckTales, I can't remember which. Our house was a long, narrow rectangle. The front door sat in an alcove halfway down the hall that connected all the rooms. My bedroom was at one end near the kitchen. It was a simple setup, but had this weird vibe sometimes, like the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I chalked it up to loneliness after my dad's death. I got up from the couch when the cartoon hit a commercial break. The microwave beeped, and I figured popcorn would be a good idea since dinner probably wasn't happening until Mom got back, if she even bothered to come home for it. As I walked across the hallway from my room toward the kitchen, I froze mid-step. There was someone standing in the hall, right in the middle by the alcove near the front door. It was a figure, a person-shaped mass, tall and solid but somehow not. The weird thing was, it didn't have any features. No face, no hair, no clothes. Just a dark blue silhouette like someone had cut the shape of a grown man out of thick fog and left it standing there. For a few seconds, I just stood there blinking, trying to process what I was looking at. My brain ran through every possible explanation. Was it a shadow? Number shadows don't just stand in the middle of the hall without being cast by something. Was it a person? Maybe some creep broke into the house? But why would they just stand there like that? The afternoon sunlight poured in from the window near the living room. Everything was bright and ordinary, except for this thing in front of me. It didn't move. It just stood there, facing me, like it was waiting for something. I wasn't scared at first, just confused. I kept thinking, this isn't real. It can't be. But it didn't go away. It stayed right there, solid as anything else in the house. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. The air seemed heavier, thicker, like breathing had become a little harder. A faint ringing started in my ears, like the house itself had gone silent and was waiting too. Something about it wasn't right, and my gut knew it before my brain caught up. That's when the fear kicked in, creeping up my spine and settling in my chest. I don't know why I did it, but I thought 2 words as clearly as if I'd said them out loud. Go away. I didn't speak, but the thought had weight, like it carried more force than just a regular passing idea. The second I thought those words, the figure moved. It turned sharply to the side like it had just received an order and sprinted into the alcove near the front door. I don't know if you've ever seen something that wasn't supposed to be able to run actually take off, but it's one of the most unnatural things you can imagine. Its movement was quick and fluid, like a person, but faster than any person should be. Adrenaline shot through me, and without thinking, I bolted after it. I reached the alcove just a second or two later, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. There was nothing there. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. There was nowhere it could have gone. Nowhere it should have gone that fast without me hearing it. But it was gone. I stood there breathing hard, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the wall for balance. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. For a few minutes, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where it had been. The house felt too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath with me. I wanted to tell myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe I was just tired or hungry or whatever excuse made sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real, and I never saw that figure again. Story 10. My dad and I were cutting through Oregon in the dead of night during a nasty storm. We'd taken a wrong turn off the main highway. One of those decisions you regret instantly but can't backtrack from without burning an extra hour. The GPS was useless, no signal, no towns, no houses, nothing but a skinny one-lane road threading through dense forest. The rain was hammering down so hard I could barely see the trees on either side of us. Just quick flashes when lightning cracked through the sky. My dad gripped the wheel, white-knuckled, his jaw tight as we crept up a winding mountain road. I was riding shotgun, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of civilization, though I doubted there was much out here besides trees and wild animals. We rounded a sharp bend, and that's when I saw it. Something weird flashing over the ridge to our left. At first I thought it was lightning, but it wasn't right. It wasn't random. It had this weird mechanical rhythm to it. Flash, pause, like someone flicking a light switch in perfect time. "Dad, you see that?" I asked, leaning forward, trying to make sense of it through the sheets of rain. He glanced up briefly, eyes flicking between the road and the glowing sky. "Yeah, no idea what it is. Probably some weather station." He shrugged, trying to sound casual, but I could tell he was just focused on keeping us on the slick, twisting road. I wasn't convinced. I'd never seen anything like that before. And I grew up in a part of Kentucky where weird stuff in the woods wasn't exactly unheard of. But this was different. We kept driving, the rain pounding on the roof, tires splashing through standing water. The flashing light stayed visible through the trees as we climbed higher up the ridge. It wasn't getting closer, just brighter. Then we crested the hill and the road opened up into a wide valley. That's when we saw it for real. It was just hovering there above the treetops. A massive, glowing sphere of blue light, maybe 50 feet up, perfectly round and humming with this low, unsettling vibration that I could feel in my chest more than I could hear. It had to be at least 20, maybe 30 feet in diameter. The rain didn't seem to touch it, it just hung there, untouched by the storm like it was from a different world altogether. And then there was the bolt. A single blinding bolt of light shot down from the base of the ball, striking the same tree over and over again, perfectly timed with that strobing flash we'd seen earlier. Crack, pause, crack, pause. Like the thing was charging itself off that poor tree, or trying to burn it down completely. "Holy!" I started, but my voice caught in my throat. Dad didn't say a word. He just gritted his teeth and kept driving, though his eyes kept flicking toward the thing as we passed by it. I could feel the tension radiating off him. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't normal. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know," Dad said, his voice low and controlled, the way it always got when he was trying not to panic. "But we're not stopping to find out." The road curved again, taking us down into the valley and further from the light, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. That bolt kept striking the same spot, lighting up the whole valley like a twisted lightning show. The tree it was hitting should have been ash by now, but it was still standing, almost like it was frozen in time. I had this overwhelming urge to tell Dad to stop the car, to pull over so we could watch it. But there was another part of me, the part that knew better, screaming to just keep going, to get out of there. As we rounded the next bend, the sphere disappeared behind the trees. The light faded, and the valley went dark again, swallowed up by the storm. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The only sound was the rain and the steady thrum of the engine as we wound our way down the mountain. "You saw it, right?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Dad said quietly. "I saw it." "What do you think it was?" He shook his head. "Don't know. Don't care. Let's just get to the next town." And that was it. We didn't talk about it again for the rest of the drive. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.